She didn't know if it was morning or afternoon. The canvas above her head had gone dark 3 days ago, not from night, but from snow. It had piled so high on top of the wagon that it blocked every seam of light, and now the interior existed in a permanent grey half-dark, like the inside of a closed eye. Marta Halverson had stopped trying to track time by light. She tracked it by the baby instead, by when Tobias cried, by when he fed, by when he went quiet. He had been quiet for 2 hours. That was the thing that frightened her most. Not the cold, which had moved past the point of feeling like cold, and had become something else, a pressure, a weight, something that sat on the chest and made breathing feel like labor. Not the hunger, which she had learned in the past 11 days to fold into a smaller and smaller corner of her mind, until it became almost abstract. The silence from Tobias's corner of the wagon was the one thing she could not reduce, could not reframe, could not make smaller than it was. She held a tin cup against her sternum, pressed flat between her wool coat and her skin. Inside the cup was snow. Her own body heat was melting it, slowly, a process that took the better part of an hour to produce enough water for a single swallow. The stove had been cold for 36 hours. There was no wood left to feed it. The temperature inside the wagon, which Lars had measured with a small brass thermometer 3 nights ago before the thermometer itself cracked, had been sitting at somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees below zero. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if these stories stay with you. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It never stops fascinating. People from every corner of the world gathered around the same fire. Outside, the wind had been blowing at what felt like a constant, insane velocity for 11 days. Not gusting, constant. A single sustained note, somewhere between a howl and a roar, that had long since stopped registering as a sound and had become the silence itself. The baseline against which all other sounds were measured. Marta knew 3 things with certainty. She knew that the snow outside had covered the wagon to its canvas roof, which meant that even if she could open the rear flap, frozen shut since day 4, she would be pushing against a wall of compacted white. She knew that her daughter Sigrid, 9 years old, had not complained about hunger in 2 days, and that this was not because Sigrid had stopped being hungry. And she knew that her husband Lars was asleep in the far corner of the wagon with his back to the family, and that he had been asleep or pretending to be asleep for most of the last 20 hours. What she did not know was whether anyone was coming. The Dakota Territory in January of 1887 was not a place that came to find you. The nearest settlement with more than a handful of structures was 12 miles northeast, across open prairie that in these conditions might as well have been the surface of the moon. No roads existed, only tracks, and the tracks had been erased within the first 6 hours of the storm. Even if someone in that settlement had known the Halversons were out there, even if someone had wanted to come, the blizzard would have killed that person before they reached the halfway point. 500 settlers died in the Dakota Territory during the winter of 1886 and 1887. Many of them were found in the spring, frozen in positions that suggested they had simply sat down. Some were found within sight of buildings. One man was found 40 yards from his own front door, close enough that rescuers initially assumed he had been trying to get back inside. He had been moving in the wrong direction. Marta did not know these numbers. She knew only her own situation, which was this. 11 days into a blizzard that showed no sign of ending, buried inside a 10-foot wooden box with 3 children, and a husband who had gone somewhere inside himself that she could not reach, running out of everything that mattered: wood, food, warmth, time, and holding a tin cup of melting snow against her chest as though it were the most important object in the world. It was. At that moment, it genuinely was. She was 34 years old. She had crossed an ocean, crossed 2 states, and survived 1 blizzard already that season. A smaller one, back in October, that had seemed catastrophic at the time, and now seemed, in retrospect, like a rehearsal, like the weather had been practicing. She had buried a child in Minnesota. She had eaten meals that were mostly hot water with a potato in them and called it sufficient. She was not a woman who broke easily, and she knew this about herself the way you know the weight of something you carry every day. But day 11 was different from day 10 in a way that was hard to name. Something had shifted in the arithmetic of the situation. The numbers had stopped adding up in her favor. She looked at Tobias in his corner. His chest was moving, shallow but moving. The cough that had started 4 nights ago had deepened and changed pitch. It no longer sounded like irritation, like something that wanted to clear itself. It sounded like something settling in. Marta pressed the tin cup harder against her sternum and did not think about what came next. Thinking about what came next cost warmth. Everything cost warmth now. Every thought, every movement, every small act of hope, it all drew from the same diminishing account. Sigrid was awake in the opposite corner, her eyes open in the dark, her lips moving silently. She had been playing a game she invented on day 3. A counting game, a naming game, some private system of rules that she had never explained to anyone. Her fingers moved against each other in a specific pattern. She did not ask for food. She did not ask when the storm would stop. She simply counted. Eric was not in the wagon. He had gone out through the front flap, which could still be forced open against the snow, 20 minutes ago. He went out every few hours to pack more snow against the wagon's base, a trick he had read about somewhere or learned from someone, the specific origin of which he had never said. He was 14 years old. He had been doing this since day 2, going out in the dark and the wind, spending 10 or 15 minutes pressing snow into the gaps beneath the wagon body, and then coming back inside with his face raw and his eyebrows white. He never said it was cold. He never said he was tired. Marta had not yet asked herself what this cost him. She was about to find out, but first she had to understand how the Halversons had arrived here, not just in this ravine, in this buried wagon, on this particular stretch of the Dakota Plains. She had to understand the world that made this moment possible, the world that told people like Lars and Marta Halverson that what lay on the other side of this journey was worth the journey, the world that was at this exact moment utterly indifferent to whether they survived it. That world had a specific shape, a specific smell, a specific sound, and it had started not with a storm but with a promise. The promise had a name. It was printed on a pamphlet. Thousands of them had been distributed across the eastern United States, and more aggressively across northern Europe, Norway, Sweden, Germany, Denmark, by land agents working on commission for the railroads and for the territorial government of Dakota. The pamphlets described a land of extraordinary fertility, mild summers and winters that were, in the language of one particularly ambitious document, brisk but manageable. Some pamphlets included illustrations, neat farmhouses, fat cattle, fields of wheat stretching to a clean horizon. None of them included a picture of what the horizon looked like in January. None of them mentioned what the wind did when there was nothing, not a single tree, not a hill, not a building, to slow it down. The Dakota Territory in the 1880s was the fastest settling region in American history. The Homestead Act of 1862 had offered 160 acres of federal land to any adult who would live on it and improve it for 5 years. Free land. The size of a small farm in Norway would cost a family decades of debt. Here, it cost 5 years of work and a $10 filing fee. The math seemed simple. Hundreds of thousands of people did the math and packed their belongings. What the math left out was the land itself. The northern Great Plains, in what is now North Dakota, South Dakota, and parts of Montana and Nebraska, is one of the most climatically extreme inhabited regions on Earth. It is not extreme in a dramatic, visible way. There are no mountains, no canyons, no obvious markers of danger. It is extreme in the way a blank page is extreme, through pure, featureless exposure. The land is flat for distances that strain comprehension. The sky is not a backdrop. It is the primary feature, occupying perhaps 3/4 of everything visible, and in winter it turns a specific shade of white-grey that has no equivalent in any landscape that has trees or hills to interrupt it. Wind is the mechanism by which this landscape kills. On the open plains, there is nothing to break it. A storm system moving down from Canada accelerates across the flat terrain the way water accelerates down a slope, picking up speed, picking up snow, packing it into a horizontal wall of white that moves faster than a running horse and hits harder than anyone who has not experienced it can imagine. The technical term is a ground blizzard. The practical meaning is that visibility drops to 0 within minutes, that sound becomes meaningless because the wind consumes it, and that a person caught outside without shelter can lose their sense of direction so completely that they will walk in circles until they fall down. Settlers who came from Norway knew cold. This was not the cold they knew. Norwegian cold was still cold. It came down from mountains, pooled in valleys, froze rivers cleanly. It had a quality of precision. Dakota cold was different. It was a systemic cold, a cold that came from every direction simultaneously, that found gaps in clothing and gaps in reasoning with equal efficiency. Experienced Norwegian farmers who arrived in Dakota in the 1870s and survived their first winter wrote letters home that used the same phrase in different ways. It is not like anything I expected. Not from men who had spent their lives outdoors. Not from people who considered themselves prepared. A covered wagon was not designed for winter habitation. This point cannot be overstated. The standard prairie schooner, the wagon that carried the Halverson family and tens of thousands of families like them, was a wooden cargo box, roughly 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, mounted on 4 wheels, with a canvas bonnet stretched over a series of curved hickory bows. The canvas was treated with linseed oil to repel rain. It was not insulated. It had no floor heating. The only warmth came from a small cast-iron stove, no larger than a suitcase, vented through a metal pipe that poked through the canvas at the rear. When that stove was burning well-seasoned hardwood, it could raise the interior temperature to something approaching livable. When the wood was wet or green or simply gone, the interior temperature tracked the outside temperature with a lag of roughly 1 hour. 1 hour, that was the margin. Inside that 10-foot space, a family stored everything they owned. Food in barrels and sacks, tools, clothing, seed for the spring planting, children's blankets, a Bible, whatever small objects they had carried from the country they'd left behind. The Halverson wagon had, in addition to these standard items, a wooden box containing Martha's journal, a small painted wooden horse that had belonged to their daughter Astrid, and a brass-framed photograph of Martha's parents that had been taken in Bergen in 1871 and had survived the Atlantic crossing wrapped in 3 layers of wool. The space that remained after all of this was perhaps large enough to lie down in if everyone arranged themselves carefully. 5 people lived in this space. Settlers who arrived in the Dakota Territory in the early 1880s were entering a land in the middle of a transformation so fast and so total that the infrastructure of survival had not yet caught up with the speed of arrival. In 1878, the entire Dakota Territory had fewer than 17,000 non-indigenous residents. By 1885, that number had risen past 550,000. Towns appeared on the prairie almost overnight: Huron, Aberdeen, Bismarck, Pierre, but the distance between them remained vast, the roads between them remained primitive, and the systems that a person in crisis actually needed, a doctor, a telegraph office, a supply of emergency provisions, remained concentrated in those towns and nowhere else. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had established weather observation stations across the territory by the mid-1880s. They could measure temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed. They could transmit warnings by telegraph to stations that had telegraph lines. The problem was the last mile, or more accurately, the last 40 miles. A storm warning issued from the station at Bismarck on a Tuesday morning might appear in a small-town newspaper on Thursday. Settlers living outside of town, which was most settlers, might hear about it Friday if someone happened to ride past and mention it. By Friday, the storm would have already happened. The winter of 1886 began in a way that made all of this seem manageable. October was warm, unseasonably, almost suspiciously warm. Temperatures running 10 to 15 degrees above their historical averages across the northern plains. Cattle that ranchers would normally have moved to lower pastures were left on the open range because the grass was still good and the sky still blue. Settlers who had planned to complete their final supply runs before the first hard freeze found themselves with extra weeks of mild weather and used them to push a little further west, file a few more claims, make one more trip that the calendar said should have already been impossible. This was the trap, not the cold, the warmth, every extra day of mild weather in October 1886 was a day someone decided not to turn back. Every blue sky was a reason to believe the pamphlet had been right after all. The land agent's promise seemed, for a few weeks, to be coming true. And that feeling, that specific loosening of caution that comes with unexpected good fortune, is precisely what the winter of 1886 needed in order to do what it was about to do. Somewhere in that warm October, 40 miles east of their homestead claim, the Halverson family made the same calculation as everyone else. They looked at the sky. They looked at the distance remaining. Lars checked the wheel that had the mismatched spoke. It was holding. The supplies were sufficient for another 2 weeks of travel, and then some. The baby was healthy. Eric had shot a prairie hen the previous morning, and they had eaten well. Everything pointed forward. The first snow came on the 15th of October. It came fast, and it came mean, and it was only the beginning. Though no one standing in it could have known what it was the beginning of. What happened to the Halversons in that first storm, and the decision they made when it ended, was the pivot on which everything else would turn. Lars Halverson was not a dreamer. That distinction matters because many of the men who came west in the 1880s were precisely that, men running toward a vision, toward something bright and unformed that lived in the future and justified any present hardship. Lars was not built that way. He was a farmer's son from a valley outside Bergen, a man who had spent his entire life measuring things. The depth of soil, the weight of a harvest, the exact number of days between the last frost and the first. He made decisions the way he drove a fence post, deliberately with the full weight of his body, checking twice that it was straight before moving to the next one. He had come to America not because of a dream, but because of two numbers. The first number was the harvest yield from his farm in 1880, 40% of the previous year, after a wet summer rotted half the barley in the ground. The second number was the yield in 1881, 31%. 2 years of those numbers in a row told Lars everything he needed to know about the trajectory he was on. He sold what he could, kept what he could carry, and booked passage for himself and Marta on a steamship out of Bergen in the spring of 1882. He did not look back at the dock. Marta did. She looked back until the coastline disappeared, and then she opened her journal and wrote the first entry, in a leather-bound book she had bought specifically for the journey. And what she wrote was not about the future. It was a precise physical description of the harbour as it had looked from the ship's railing, the colour of the water, the specific angle of the morning light on the buildings. She was 30 years old. She had been keeping journals since she was 12. They settled first in Minnesota, outside a town called Moorhead, where a small Norwegian community had already established itself with a church, a grain cooperative, and a shared understanding of how to manage a winter that was cold, but not, by Dakota standards, serious. Lars worked other men's farms for 2 seasons while he learned the language, learned the land, learned which American tools were better than their Norwegian equivalents and which were worse. He was a fast study for practical things. The English language took longer. He never fully lost the cadence of Norwegian in his speech, even decades later. But by 1884 he could negotiate, argue, and calculate in it well enough. Marta learned faster. She always had. Her English by the end of the first year was fluent enough to read newspapers, and she read them the way she read everything, thoroughly, with annotations in the margins. She kept up with the land debates, the railroad politics, the reports from territorial settlers filing their claims. When Lars first mentioned the Dakota Territory as a possibility, in the winter of 1883, it was Marta who had already read 3 separate accounts of the journey and had made a list in the back of her journal of what would be needed and what would likely go wrong. The list ran to 2 pages. They lost Astrid in August of 1884. She was 4 years old. A fever, the specific type, was never recorded, which was not unusual for rural Minnesota in that era, that came on a Tuesday and was over by Saturday. Lars built the coffin himself from pine boards he had been saving to floor the kitchen of the house he was planning to build. The grave was in the churchyard in Moorhead. Marta visited it the morning they left for Dakota 2 years later, and did not visit it the evening before, which Eric later said he never understood, and which Marta never explained. There were things Marta did not explain. There were many of them. Eric had been born in Norway in 1872, which made him 14 when the family left for Dakota in September of 1886. He was tall for his age, already within an inch of Lars's height, with his father's long-fingered hands and his mother's habit of going quiet when he was thinking hard about something. He had been his father's helper since he could walk and carry things simultaneously. But he was also, in ways Lars did not always notice, his mother's son, the one who read her face before he read a room, the one who understood without being told when a situation required action versus when it required stillness. Sigrid was 9, loud where Eric was quiet, physically fearless in a way that had already produced 2 broken fingers and a scar above her left eyebrow. She had Marta's dark hair and Lars's stubbornness, a combination that produced, in practice, a child who was extremely difficult to discourage. She had cried twice on the entire journey from Minnesota. Once, when the wagon got a wheel stuck crossing a creek and she thought they would have to abandon it, and once, very briefly, the night they learned the October storm was coming. She had not cried since. Tobias had been born in the spring of 1885 in the Minnesota farmhouse, in the middle of a thunderstorm so loud that Marta had written in her journal that she could not hear herself making any sound at all. He was 14 months old when the family departed for Dakota. He had spent most of his life in motion, first in a cradle, then on a blanket on the wagon floor, surrounded by the sounds of wheels and wind and the low, ongoing conversation of a family conducting its daily life. He had never known a room with 4 solid walls. The wagon itself was a character in this story as much as any of them. Lars had bought it from a family in Moorhead who had made the Dakota journey, turned back after 1 season, and wanted nothing more to do with the territory or anything associated with it. He paid $60 for it, a fair price for a wagon in that condition, with a sound canvas, a working stove, and most of the original hardware intact. The mismatched wheel spoke was the only visible flaw. Lars had examined it carefully before purchasing, pressed his thumb into the wood, tested the fit of the iron tire around the rim. He decided it would hold. It was the kind of decision he was good at. Specific, technical, based on direct physical evidence. What he could not have known was that the family selling him the wagon had made 1 modification of their own, a small one. They had replaced the original rear axle pin with one that was slightly undersized, a repair made in haste during their return journey and never disclosed because it functioned well enough in mild conditions. It would matter? Not yet. But it would. By September of 1886, the Halverson family was on the road west. The journey from Moorhead to their claim in what would become Sully County was approximately 340 miles. In reasonable conditions, with a healthy team of horses, this was a journey of 3 to 4 weeks. The Halversons had 2 horses, a large bay named Bram and a smaller grey mare with no official name, called only Grå, the Norwegian word for grey. They had provisions for 6 weeks, salt pork, dried beans, flour, cornmeal, dried apples, a small barrel of molasses, coffee. Lars had allocated the supplies carefully, with a 10% buffer built into every calculation. The journey started well. The weather held. The roads were dry. They travelled with 2 other families for the first 2 weeks. The Ostroms, a Norwegian couple with no children, and a newer wagon, and a single man named Connolly, an Irishman from Chicago who was filing his first claim and had attached himself to the group somewhere outside of Fargo with a friendliness that precluded refusal. The 3 wagons moved together at a pace of 15 to 20 miles a day, camping each night, sharing meals twice a week, the children and the horses both adjusting to the rhythm of movement. The Ostroms turned north toward their own claim somewhere around the 3rd week. Connolly continued west for another 3 days before his wagon veered off on a track that led toward a different township. The Halversons were alone after that, 40 miles from their destination, the sky still blue, the prairie grass bent, but not yet brown. Lars checked the wheel, spoke on the morning of October 14. It was holding. Marta wrote in her journal that evening, the last entry before the first storm, a single line about the sky. She wrote that it had been a particular shade of orange at sunset, the kind she had not seen since Norway, and that looking at it had made her feel for one moment that she understood exactly why they had come. The next morning, the birds were gone. Not fewer birds. No birds. The prairie, which had maintained a constant low background of sound throughout the journey, meadowlarks, blackbirds, the occasional hawk, went completely silent before dawn on October 15th. Lars noticed it when he went out to check the horses at first light. The silence was so total and so sudden that he stood next to Bram for a full minute, listening to it before he understood what he was hearing. He understood before the sky changed. He understood before the first flake fell. He went back to the wagon and told Marta. Not in so many words. Lars rarely used so many words. But in the way he moved, the way he checked the rope securing the canvas at the rear, the way he looked at the children, and then at the sky, and then back at the children. Marta was already reaching for the extra blankets before he finished moving. The first storm hit at mid-morning. It was bad. But it was not the storm from the opening of this story. That storm was still 3 months away, and it was going to be something else entirely. Something that the October storm had not prepared them for at all, despite what Lars believed when the sky finally cleared and the sun came out and the prairie glittered white and innocent in every direction. The question now was what they would do with the time between. The October storm lasted 2 days and deposited 14 inches of snow across the prairie. By the standards of what was coming, it was a minor event. At the time, it did not feel minor. It felt like the land had made a decision about them, had turned suddenly and without negotiation from something that tolerated their presence to something that actively contested it. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours. The wind arrived before the snow, which meant the snow arrived sideways, compacting against the wagon's canvas in a way that made the interior sound like someone was throwing gravel at it continuously for 48 hours without stopping. They survived it without serious injury. This was the problem. Lars managed the stove with the precision of a man who understood fuel. He burned exactly as much wood as was necessary to keep the interior above freezing, not a stick more, rationing with a care that kept their supply intact through both days and left them with more than half their wood remaining when the storm cleared. He used the time to inventory everything in the wagon, every sack, every barrel, every tool, and to calculate with his farmer's arithmetic how long each supply would last under various scenarios. He found a gap between the canvas and the rear bow that was letting cold air in and packed it with a strip of wool cut from a spare blanket. He checked the horses twice daily, moving carefully through the snow to where they were tied in the partial shelter of a shallow depression in the land, feeding them from the hay stored beneath the wagon. The wagon held, the family held, the stove held. When the sky cleared on the morning of October 17th and the sun came out over an entirely white and still landscape, Lars stood outside the wagon for a long time. His breath came out in long, visible plumes. The cold was still serious, well below freezing, but the wind was gone, and without the wind, the cold had a different character. It was simply cold. He could think in it. He could plan. He made his decision before he went back inside. 40 miles, 3 days of travel in good conditions, perhaps 4, given the snow on the ground. They had enough food. The horses were healthy. The wheel spoke had held through 2 days of immobility and would certainly hold for 4 days of careful movement. The claim was waiting. The 5-year clock on the Homestead Act requirement had started the moment he filed the paperwork, which meant every day they did not build on that land was a day wasted. He had calculated this many times. Marta read his face when he climbed back into the wagon. She did not argue. She wrote one sentence in her journal that evening in Norwegian. "Vi burde ha snudd. We should have turned back." She wrote it, and then she closed the journal and helped Lars repack the wagon for departure. They were moving again by the following morning. What Lars did not know, what almost no one on the northern plains knew yet, was that the October storm was not an isolated event. It was the first movement in a season of extraordinary violence, a winter that meteorologists would later study as a convergence of factors almost without precedent, a persistent blocking pattern in the upper atmosphere that funneled Arctic air south with unusual frequency, a snowpack that built on itself instead of melting between storms, and a temperature baseline across the northern plains that sat, from November onward, an average of 18 degrees below the historical norm for the region. The U.S. Signal Corps station in Bismarck had recorded something troubling in October: the barometric readings, the temperature anomalies, the specific character of the storm systems. The observer at the station, a man named Sergeant William Murphy, who had been stationed there for 3 years and had seen 2 previous hard winters, wrote in his log that the October storm had a quality of persistence he associated with severe winters. He flagged it in his official report. The report traveled by telegraph to Washington. Nobody traveling by wagon on the Dakota Prairie received it. This was the architecture of the trap. Not stupidity, not carelessness. A gap in information so structural and so complete that the people most in danger of the coming winter were precisely the people with no access to any warning it was coming. November passed in increments. The Halversons reached their claim on October 22nd, 5 days after resuming travel, moving slowly over snow-covered ground with Lars walking beside the horses for the last 2 days to reduce the wagon's weight on terrain that had grown soft and uncertain. The claim was a piece of land indistinguishable from every other piece of land around it, flat, treeless, bounded by no features except a small, frozen creek to the east and a slight rise to the northwest that provided, in theory, a windbreak of modest dimensions. Lars had chosen it from a surveyor's map based on the creek and the rise. Standing on it for the first time, with the wind coming hard from the northwest and the temperature already dropping toward the teens, both features looked considerably less substantial than they had appeared on paper. There was no time to build. A proper settler's cabin, even the most basic sod house, cut from the prairie itself, required weeks of work. The ground was already frozen too hard to cut sod effectively. Lars spent the first 3 days on the claim constructing something more modest, a windbreak of stacked sod blocks around 3 sides of the wagon, low enough to build quickly, but substantial enough to interrupt the wind's direct contact with the canvas. He dug out the earth beneath the wagon several inches and packed it with the dried grass he could still find at the creek's edge. He rerouted the stovepipe so that it exited through the side canvas rather than the rear, which allowed the rear flap to be sealed more completely. It was good work, competent, efficient, practical. It was also insufficient for what was coming in ways that no amount of competence could have fully addressed. December arrived with 2 more storms, smaller than October's, but relentless, arriving within days of each other and depositing snow that did not melt between them. The temperature during the cold stretches dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Tobias developed his first cold, recovered, developed another. The horses grew gaunt despite careful rationing of hay. Lars shot 2 rabbits in December and a prairie grouse, and these made a material difference to the food situation, not because the family was starving, but because the cold was consuming calories faster than the original supply calculations had accounted for. A human body in sustained extreme cold does not behave the way it does in mild temperatures. The basal metabolic rate, the energy a person burns simply staying alive before any movement or labor, increases significantly in cold because the body is continuously working to maintain its core temperature. At -20 degrees Fahrenheit, this baseline caloric need can rise by 30 to 40% above normal. Lars had calculated the family's food requirements based on what a Norwegian farming family used in a cold winter. He had not calculated for this. Nobody had told him the difference. The difference was the gap between surviving and not surviving, and it was measured in beans and flour and the gradually lightening weight of the supply barrels. In January, the weather changed again. The first week of January 1887 brought a brief warming, temperatures rising above freezing for 3 days, enough to soften the snow surface, enough to make the frozen creek groan and shift. Lars used the time to attempt a supply run toward the nearest settlement, 12 miles northeast. He got 6 miles before the axle pin, the undersized one, the undisclosed repair made by the family he'd bought the wagon from, sheared under the stress of the frozen, rutted track. He spent 4 hours in below-freezing temperatures making a field repair with what he had, lost the light, made camp by the trail, and returned the following day with what he had been able to carry on his back, a small sack of cornmeal, a tin of lard, 4 candles. He told Marta the repair was solid. She looked at the axle and wrote nothing in her journal that night. The warming ended on January 8th. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, then kept dropping. On the morning of January 9th, Lars went out at dawn to check the horses and stood for a full minute in the silence before it registered. The same silence he had heard before the October storm, but larger, deeper. The kind of silence that doesn't come from an absence of sound, but from the suppression of it, as though the air itself had thickened. The birds had been gone since the previous afternoon. He hadn't noticed until now. By mid-morning, the sky to the northwest had turned a color that settlers in the region described consistently in their accounts as dirty yellow. Not the blue-black of a thunderstorm, not the flat grey of ordinary snow clouds, but something yellowed and wrong, low and fast-moving, eating the horizon as it came. Lars had 12 minutes between the moment he first saw that sky and the moment the storm reached the wagon. He used all 12 of them. He tied the horses as close to the wagon as their lines allowed, secured every loose item, brought in every tool from outside, checked the stove fuel. Not enough, not nearly enough, but more than 0. And pulled the canvas rear flap shut and tied it from the inside with a knot he had learned as a boy on a fishing boat in the North Sea. The storm hit like something solid. This was the detail that separated the January blizzard from the October storm in every account written by every settler who survived that winter. The January storms did not build. They arrived. One moment there was wind, and the next moment there was a wall. Snow so dense and wind so fast that the two became indistinguishable, a horizontal white mass moving at speeds later estimated at 60 to 70 miles per hour, dropping the temperature with it as it came, carrying Arctic air from Canada that had been building for weeks and was now moving south with nothing to stop it and everything to accelerate it. Inside the wagon, the sound was nothing like the October storm. This was not gravel against canvas. This was something that wanted in. The canvas bowed inward with each gust, pressing against the bows with a groan that sounded, Marta later wrote, like a living thing. The temperature inside dropped 10 degrees in the first hour. Lars fed the stove carefully, measuring each piece of wood against the supply, doing the arithmetic in his head with a face that showed nothing. Marta watched him do the arithmetic. She had already done her own. The numbers were not the same. Lars's calculation assumed the storm would last 2 to 3 days, as the October storm had. Marta's calculation assumed something she could not name yet, a duration she did not have data to quantify, only the quality of that yellow sky and the particular way the wind had arrived, not building but detonating, and a feeling she had carried since the morning the birds disappeared that this storm was not operating by the same rules as the last one. She did not tell Lars what her calculation said. She looked at the stove, she looked at the wood, she looked at Tobias sleeping on his blanket with his small chest, rising and falling in the cold air. 3 days of wood, if they were careful. 4, if they were very careful. Outside, the storm pressed against every surface of the wagon simultaneously, looking for the place it would finally get through. It had found that place already, they just didn't know it yet. The first day inside the storm was mostly management. Lars ran the stove in cycles, burning for 2 hours, letting it die back to coals for 1, burning again. This was not a technique he had read about or been taught. It was arithmetic made physical, the wood supply divided by the estimated storm duration, converted into a schedule he kept in his head and checked against the small brass thermometer mounted on the interior wagon bow. When the temperature inside dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, he fed the stove. When it climbed above 30, he pulled back. The goal was not warmth, the goal was survival temperature, the minimum thermal environment in which 5 human bodies could continue to function without beginning the long, slow process of shutting down. 20 degrees Fahrenheit is not warm. To understand what it feels like to inhabit a space held at 20 degrees, consider that your kitchen freezer runs at 0, and that 20 degrees is cold enough to freeze exposed skin within 30 minutes, cold enough to make metal painful to touch with bare hands, cold enough that breathing through your nose produces a faint, burning sensation with each inhale. This was the target. This was what Lars was defending against the outside, which was running somewhere between 30 and 40 below. The gap between inside and outside was 50 degrees of hard labor. Marta organized the interior of the wagon on day 1 with the systematic focus of someone who understood that disorder in a small space costs more than disorder in a large one. Every item had a position. The food went against the front wall, grouped by type, accessible without fully unpacking anything. The children's extra clothing went under the sleeping area, flat and dry. The water supply, 2 wooden buckets, a tin basin, and the small barrel that Lars had filled from the creek before the storm hit, went nearest to the stove because water left more than 2 feet from the heat source would freeze solid within hours. She repositioned Tobias's blanket nest so that his body was between hers and Sigrid's at night, sandwiched in human warmth from both sides. She did all of this without being asked and without announcing what she was doing. The horses were the first crisis that was not the storm itself. Bram and Graw were tied outside in the partial shelter of the sod windbreak Lars had built, with a canvas sheet rigged between 2 poles as an additional barrier against the direct wind. They had hay, a supply Lars had calculated to last through a 3-day storm. On day 1, both horses were alive and standing. Lars checked them in the morning and the evening, each visit requiring him to force open the front canvas flap against the wind pressure, drop to the ground, and navigate 30 feet of zero-visibility white chaos to reach them. He moved with a rope tied around his waist and secured to the wagon's front axle, a precaution he had decided on before the storm hit. Without it, those 30 feet of blowing snow could have been 30 miles. In the Dakota Territory during the winter of 1886 to 87, at least 11 settlers died within 100 feet of shelter. They went out for firewood or to check animals, lost their bearings in the whiteout, and wandered in the wrong direction until they fell. One woman was found 20 feet from her front door, face down in the snow, with her hand outstretched in the direction of her house. The rope Lars used was not an innovation. The settlers who had survived previous hard winters had figured this out, and word had spread through the informal networks of prairie survival. Lars had heard about the rope technique from a man in a hardware store in Moorhead who had mentioned it the way people mention things they know are important but hope will not become relevant. Day 2, the wood supply became the weather inside the weather. Lars had started the storm with what he estimated as 72 hours of fuel at his burn rate. 48 hours in, he recalculated. The temperature outside had not moderated as it had during the October storm. It had dropped further, which meant the stove had to work harder to maintain even the 20-degree interior threshold. His revised estimate, 60 hours of fuel, not 72. The storm showed no sign of ending. He shaved the burn cycles thinner, accepting a drop to 15 degrees during the rest periods, watching the thermometer the way a surgeon watches a monitor. 15 degrees Fahrenheit inside a wagon is the temperature at which water left in a cup overnight becomes ice by morning. The children adapted in ways that were specific to each of them. Sigrid had moved entirely into her finger-counting game by day 2. She played it for hours, her lips moving, her eyes focused on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the interior of the wagon. She ate when food appeared without asking what it was or how much there was. She slept with the focused thoroughness of someone conserving energy by instinct rather than design. Eric helped Lars with the horses on every check, which meant he went outside twice a day into conditions that were, by any reasonable measure, genuinely dangerous for a 14-year-old. But his size and his coordination made him useful, and Lars needed useful more than he needed caution. Tobias ate, Tobias slept. Tobias made small sounds that were not yet words. The food on day 2 was beans, dried navy beans soaked overnight in the wooden bucket and boiled on the stove in a pot that also served as the only source of steam heat in the wagon, the moisture rising from the cooking water and providing a marginal but real improvement in air quality. Dried beans in a sealed wagon on the Dakota Plains in 1887 were not a hardship food by the standards of what came later. They were dense with calories, they filled the stomach, and the act of cooking them produced warmth and smell, two things that were doing more psychological work than Marta consciously recognized at the time. What she recognized was that the molasses barrel was already 1/3 gone. Molasses was not a luxury in a 19th century frontier diet. It was a primary calorie source, thick, sweet, dense with energy, in a form the body could use quickly, the kind of fuel that matters most when the body is working hardest. Mixed into cornmeal mush, stirred into hot water as a crude tea, eaten directly from a spoon by children who needed the energy, it served functions that nothing else in the wagon could fully replace. 1/3 gone in 2 days. Marta looked at this and adjusted every calculation she had been running. Outside, the storm did not negotiate. On day 3, Lars burned 2 extra pieces of wood, a decision Marta saw him make and did not challenge, because the temperature during the night had dropped to levels where the brass thermometer registered something she had not seen it register before. The indicator pin had moved below its lowest marked graduation. Below its lowest marked graduation meant below 10 degrees Fahrenheit inside the wagon. At some point in the night, Tobias had shifted in his sleep, and his foot had emerged from the blankets, and when Marta found it in the early morning darkness and took it between her hands, it was cold in a way that sent a specific type of signal through her nervous system. Not the ordinary cold of a child's foot on a winter morning, but a deeper cold, a cold with no warmth underneath it. She held his foot between her palms for 20 minutes before it pinked. What was happening outside while this small drama unfolded inside was something the Halversons could not see and could only partially hear. The snow had begun to drift. This is a specific phenomenon distinct from simply falling snow. Drifting is what happens when wind-driven snow encounters an obstacle and piles against it with a force and density that ordinary snowfall does not produce. The wagon was an obstacle. The sod windbreak was an obstacle. The snow built against both in drifts that were, by day 3, pressing against the wagon's exterior walls with a lateral pressure that creaked the wooden frame. The creaking had started on day 2. By day 3, it was a regular feature of the interior soundscape, a low, intermittent groan from the wagon's side panels, as though the structure itself was commenting on its situation. Lars packed the interior walls with blankets and spare clothing, not for insulation, but to stop the gaps that were opening at the joints as the wood contracted in the cold. A gap, the width of a thumbnail in the wall of a wagon at 30 below, is not a minor problem. It is a knife of cold air inserted directly into the interior space, cutting through any warmth the stove produces with a precision the stove cannot match. He found 4 such gaps on day 3 and packed each one. He found 2 more on day 4. On day 4, the spare wheel spoke went into the stove. Lars removed it from the wheel with a cold chisel and a hammer, working inside the wagon with his knees on the floor and his breath coming in white clouds, and fed it into the firebox in 2 pieces. The wood was hardwood, dry, dense, well-seasoned, and it burned for nearly 3 hours. 3 hours was the gap between adequate and inadequate on that particular day, and Lars watched every minute of it with the expression of a man who was adding and subtracting simultaneously. The spoke was gone. The wheel it had come from was now compromised. The wagon, already buried to its axles in drifted snow, could not be moved regardless, but the knowledge of what burning that spoke had cost beyond its heat value settled into the wagon's atmosphere and stayed there. Marta had been melting snow for supplemental water since day 2. The wagon's water barrel had frozen solid at some point during the second night, despite its position near the stove, and breaking ice from its surface and melting it cost fuel, time, and the body heat she used to hold the tin cup against her sternum through the long, slow process. What she had discovered by careful management was that the human body is a remarkably efficient heat source for small quantities of material held in direct contact with the skin. A tin cup of snow pressed between a woman's body and her wool coat would melt to drinkable water in 40 to 60 minutes. She had developed a rotation system, 3 cups working simultaneously, tucked against her body at intervals, exchanged when full, repacked when empty. The cups produced perhaps a quart of water per hour, 5 people required a minimum of 2 quarts each per day to avoid the specific danger of dehydration in cold, a danger that is counterintuitive but real because cold air is extremely dry and the body loses moisture rapidly through respiration, and because the sensation of thirst is suppressed in cold conditions, meaning people do not drink enough even when water is available. Marta knew none of the physiology. She knew that people needed water to stay alive, that the barrel was frozen, and that the cups worked. That was sufficient. Day 5 brought a change so small that only Marta noticed it at first. The wind, which had maintained its constant roar for 96 hours, shifted. Not in strength, the strength was undiminished, but in direction. It moved perhaps 10 degrees to the north, which changed the angle at which it struck the wagon, which changed the pattern of the creaking in the walls, which changed the specific texture of the cold that pressed through the gaps Lars had packed with wool. Marta noticed it the way a person notices a change in the sound of an engine they have been listening to for 4 days, not because she was waiting for it, but because her attention, in the absence of anything to look at, had turned inward and downward toward the most granular available information. She lay awake for an hour considering what a change in wind direction meant about the storm's structure. She had no meteorological training. She had read things always her whole life, newspapers and almanacs and the occasional scientific article that appeared in the Minnesota papers. She knew that storms were systems that moved, that their wind patterns shifted as they progressed. She knew that a direction shift could mean the storm's center was passing. It could also mean the storm was deepening. She looked at the stove. She looked at the wood. By her count, they had 40 hours of fuel left if Lars maintained the current burn rate. The storm had now lasted 4.5 days. The October storm had lasted 2. Something in that comparison wanted her full attention, and she gave it, lying in the dark with Tobias warm against her left side and Sigrid slow breathing on her right, while the wagon groaned around her and Lars slept with his back against the front wall, and Eric, she looked over, Eric was not in his blankets. He was sitting up in the dark, very still, watching the stove. She watched him watching it. He did not know she was awake. His face in the faint orange light from the stove's air vents was the face of someone doing arithmetic. She recognized it. It was exactly his father's face. But there was something else. Something in the way he was positioned, slightly forward, his arms wrapped around his knees, that was different from Lars's calculating stillness. Something that looked less like planning and more like vigilance, like someone standing guard. She did not know yet what he was guarding against. The answer was coming, and it was going to arrive in a form she was completely unprepared for. Day 6 arrived without announcement. There was no dawn inside the wagon. The snow piled against the canvas had seen to that since day 3, sealing the last thin lines of light that had seeped through the weave of the treated cloth. Time had become something the Halverson family measured in stove cycles and sleep intervals and the small biological rhythms of Tobias's feeding schedule. Morning was when Marta woke and the stove was low. Evening was when Lars banked it for the longest cold stretch of the night. Everything between was a grey, timeless middle that had stopped feeling like hours and started feeling like a single, sustained condition with no edges. This is what isolation does to time. It does not slow it, it dissolves it. Researchers who study people in prolonged, confined conditions, not the 1880s researchers who did not study such things, but the 20th century scientists who put people in bunkers and submarines and polar stations, found a consistent pattern. After roughly 72 hours of sensory monotony, the human brain begins to lose its grip on sequential time. Not dramatically, not in any way the person experiencing it would necessarily recognize as abnormal. The intervals between events begin to feel approximately equal regardless of their actual duration. An hour and 4 hours acquire similar weights. The mind, deprived of the external markers it uses to organize experience, begins to generate its own internal structure, patterns, rituals, repetitions, as a substitute. The Halversons were already doing this without knowing it had a name. Sigrid's finger game had evolved by day 6 into something more elaborate. A system with apparent rules that governed which sequences were valid and which required starting over, played with a concentration that excluded everything around her. She ate, she slept, she performed her share of small tasks when Marta asked her to, and then she returned to her fingers with the focus of someone completing important work. Eric had developed a habit of checking the tension on the canvas bow ropes each morning, running his fingers along each rope in sequence, testing the knot at each junction, a circuit that took perhaps 5 minutes and served no mechanical purpose since the ropes could not be adjusted from inside. He did it anyway, every morning before anything else. Marta wrote in her journal every evening. This was not new. She had kept journals for 22 years. What was new was the content. The entries had stopped being records of events and had become something more granular. Temperature observations, fuel inventory notes, a precise accounting of what each person had eaten and when. The journal had converted, without her deciding to convert it, from a personal document into a survival log. Lars had stopped talking on day 5. This was the thing Marta noticed first, not dramatically, not all at once, but as a gradual diminishment, like a fire reducing to coals. He had never been a man of surplus words, but there had always been a functional baseline of communication, observations about the weather, decisions announced before they were executed, short exchanges with Eric about the horses. By day 6, these had ceased almost entirely. He performed his tasks, the stove, the rope walk to the horses, the gap packing, the hourly check of the thermometer, with the methodical precision of a mechanism. He ate when Marta put food in front of him. He slept when the burn cycle permitted. He looked at the thermometer, and then at the wood, and then at nothing in particular, his eyes settling on a point in the middle of the wagon's interior that contained nothing. Marta had seen this before, not in Lars, in herself. After Astrid died in Minnesota, she had gone to the same place. Not grief, exactly, or not only grief, but a withdrawal into a part of the self that was deeper than functioning. A place where the essential processes continued, but the connective tissue between a person and the world went slack. She had come back from it in 3 weeks. She had come back because she had children who needed her, which was not a sentimental observation, but a practical one. Need is a rope. It pulls. Lars had children who needed him too, and he knew it, and still he was going somewhere that the knowledge of their need could not reach. This was the thing that frightened her more than the wood supply. She did not show it. She served the food, managed the water rotation, kept Tobias warm, watched Eric's face for signs of the things a 14-year-old boy's face would show if he were in danger. Fear, confusion, the particular blankness that precedes panic. She found none of these. What she found instead was a steadiness in him that she could not entirely account for, a quality of calm attention that seemed, if anything, to be increasing as the situation deteriorated. She did not find it reassuring. She found it interesting, the way you find something interesting when you do not yet understand it. On the morning of day 7, Gro was dead. Lars found her on the morning rope walk, still standing somehow, with her head dropped and her legs locked and her body already cooling in the way a large animal cools from the extremities inward. Bram was alive, pressed against the dead mare's flank for warmth, trembling in a continuous fine vibration that Lars could feel through the rope when he touched it to guide himself to them. He stood between the two horses for a long moment, the dead one and the living one in the whiteout, the wind pressing against his back with a force that required continuous muscle engagement to stand upright against, and then he came back to the wagon. He did not say anything about Gro to the children. He told Marta. She nodded once and adjusted the hay rationing in her head, because Bram now needed the full remaining supply alone, and then she went back to Tobias. What neither of them said was the larger implication. With one horse dead, and the wagon buried in drifted snow, and the repaired axle of uncertain integrity, the wagon was not a vehicle anymore. It was a structure. It was the only structure they had. The option of moving, of harnessing and driving toward the settlement 12 miles away, had existed theoretically at the storm's beginning. It no longer existed in any practical sense. They were not waiting out a storm they could leave. They were committed to a position from which there was no tactical retreat. Day 7 was also the day the flour ran low enough to matter, not out. Low. The sack, which had been a 50-pound canvas bag and had felt substantial and reassuring for the first days of the storm, had reached the point where lifting it revealed its new lightness. Not empty, but no longer full in a way that allowed for generosity. Marta began reducing the portions of cornmeal mush by a quarter, mixing in a higher ratio of water to stretch the volume without reducing the apparent serving size. She added an extra spoonful of molasses to compensate for the reduced calories, then looked at the molasses supply and reversed that decision. She added nothing extra. She reduced and said nothing. Hunger in extreme cold has a specific character distinct from ordinary hunger. It is not the sharp, nagging appetite of a skipped meal. It is a deeper absence, a hollowness that starts in the stomach but migrates outward into the muscles and the mind, producing a faint but constant tremor in the hands, a difficulty holding thoughts to their conclusions, a tendency toward the kind of repetitive thinking that circles the same few subjects without advancing. The cold and the hunger amplify each other in a feedback loop. The body needs calories to generate heat. The lack of calories reduces the body's heat output. The increased cold drives the body to demand more calories it doesn't have. Marta's hands had developed the fine tremor by day 6. She noticed it when she wrote in her journal, and the letters, slightly less even than usual, a quality of effortfulness in the pen strokes that had not been there before. She noted it in the journal itself, in the same tone she used to record the temperature, hands unsteady, likely caloric. Then she continued writing. There is a specific kind of human being who responds to crisis by becoming more precise. Marta was this kind. Lars was not. Lars's response to crisis had always been physical, movement, labor, the conversion of anxiety into constructed objects. A man who could pick up a hammer was a man who was managing. The storm had removed the hammer. There was nothing to build, nothing to fix that would materially change the situation, nothing his hands could do that would advance their position. The stove was managed, the gaps were packed, the horses had been tended to, and now one of them was dead. The arithmetic of their survival had been reduced to waiting, and waiting was not a skill Lars Halvorsen had ever developed. By day 8, he had stopped eating his full portion. Martin noticed this on the second day it happened, noticed the way he moved the food around the tin plate without reducing its volume, the way he set it aside, still half full, with a casualness that was slightly too deliberate. She said nothing at dinner. She waited until the children were asleep, and then she looked at him in the dim stove light. And he looked back at her, and she understood from his expression that he was not doing it as strategy. He was not doing it to save food for the children. He had simply stopped being hungry in the way people stop being hungry when the machinery of appetite shuts down under sustained psychological stress. She made him eat. She put the plate back in his hands and waited until he finished it, watching him with a patience that had iron in it. He finished the food and looked at the wagon wall. This was day 8. There were 6 more days to come. The psychological literature on survival isolation, written long after the Halvorsens' ordeal by researchers who had the luxury of studying people in controlled conditions, describes a phenomenon that appears consistently around the 1-week mark of severe confinement, the emergence of a dominant personality within the group, someone who was not necessarily the assumed leader before the crisis, but who becomes the functional center of gravity as the assumed leader withdraws. This person does not announce themselves. They simply begin making the decisions that stop being made, filling the space that the withdrawal creates, absorbing the additional cognitive and emotional load without asking whether they are capable of carrying it. In the Halvorsen wagon, on day 8 of the blizzard, that person was not Marta. She was the one managing the food and the water and the heat and the baby and her husband's eating and the log she kept of everything. She was doing all of this, and it was essential, and it was not enough. There was a second operation running parallel to hers, quieter and more hidden, that she had not yet fully seen. She had noticed the pieces. Eric at the stove in the night, Eric's morning rope checks, Eric's face with its strange, deepening calm. But she had not yet assembled them into a picture. The picture was assembling itself without her. Outside, on the 9th night, the wind shifted again. Not the same tentative shift as day 5, but a larger rotation, the kind that meant the storm system was changing at a structural level. The temperature dropped another 4 degrees. The stove's wood supply, by Marta's count, had 3 days left, possibly 4, with strict rationing. Tobias coughed once in the night, and then twice, and the second cough had a sound in it that was different from the first. Marta was already awake when she heard it. She had been awake since the wind shifted. She pulled Tobias closer and pressed her hand against his forehead and held it there while the stove ticked and the wagon groaned and Lars breathed in the darkness with the slow regularity of a man who had gone somewhere inside himself and closed the door. His forehead was warm, not the warmth of a child bundled in blankets. The other warmth, fever in a 14-month-old child in a space held below freezing, is a specific kind of emergency. The fever itself generates heat, the body's own defense mechanism raising its internal temperature to fight whatever has invaded it. In an ordinary room, in an ordinary winter, this is managed with cool cloths and fluids and the particular vigilance of a parent measuring time in degrees. In the Halvorsen wagon on the 9th night, with the exterior temperature at 41 below zero and the interior hovering at 18 degrees, the fever was not the only threat. The fever required fluids. Fluids required melted water. Melted water required heat. Heat required wood. The chain of dependency ran from Tobias's burning forehead all the way to the dwindling stack of fuel against the front wall, and every link in that chain was already under maximum strain. Marta did not sleep on the 9th night. She held Tobias against her chest, not cradled, but pressed flat against her sternum the way she had held the tin cups of snow, using her own body as the instrument. And she felt his fever through her wool coat and her dress and the thin cotton of his wrappings as a specific, localized heat that was wrong in its intensity and its steadiness. Ordinary warmth fluctuates. This did not. It sat at its level with the implacable quality of something that had committed to a position. His cough came every 20 to 30 minutes. Each time it deepened. She knew what she needed. She needed hot liquid, not warm, hot, to get into him, to support his body's fluid loss and give his immune system the resources it needed to do its work. She needed the interior temperature raised several degrees above its current level, because a fevered infant losing heat to a freezing environment is fighting two battles simultaneously with the resources for one. She needed, in the most stripped and practical terms, more wood than she had. She had 3 days of fuel, perhaps 4. The storm was on its 9th day with no sign of ending. The historical record for the region, which Marta did not have access to but which exists in the Signal Corps logs, shows that the temperature on January 18, 1887, across the central Dakota Territory was minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds sustained at 55 miles per hour. The wind chill equivalent, a measurement not formally calculated until decades later, was somewhere in the range of minus 80 degrees. At that number, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Metal tools left outside become brittle enough to shatter. The grease in a wagon's wheel bearings turns solid. These are not metaphors. This is what the air was made of that night. Sometime before dawn, on day 10, Lars woke and sat up and looked at Tobias and then at Marta. And something crossed his face that was different from the blank removal of the previous days. Not fully back, not the Lars who had driven fence posts and calculated harvests and bought a wagon with a careful thumb pressed into the wood, but a partial return, a fragment of presence that was better than nothing. He reached out and touched Tobias's cheek with 2 fingers. He held them there. He withdrew his hand and looked at the wood stack. He fed the stove 3 pieces instead of 2. It was the right decision, and it cost them 6 hours of fuel, and neither of them said anything about either of those facts. Day 10 was the day the food situation crossed from serious to critical. The flour sack, which Marta had been rationing with surgical precision since day 7, reached a quantity she could hold in 2 cupped hands. Not 2 cupped hands of flour. 2 cupped hands of the mixture of flour, cornmeal dust, and the dried residue scraped from the barrel's interior seams that constituted what remained of their grain supply. The salt pork barrel had 3 pieces left, each the size of a fist, suspended in brine that had partially frozen around them. The dried beans, the most reliable calorie source they had carried, were gone. The molasses jar contained perhaps 4 tablespoons. The dried apples had run out on day 8, and Marta had not written this in her journal, because writing it would have made it more true than she wanted it to be at that specific moment. She boiled leather that afternoon. The process was straightforward in its mechanics and appalling in its implications. 2 strips of rawhide cut from the spare harness hanging on the front wagon bow, boiled in water for 3 hours until they softened to a texture that could be chewed and swallowed without injuring the mouth, producing a liquid that was brown and tasted of nothing useful, but provided the stomach with something to process, which was psychologically significant even when it was nutritionally negligible. She served the liquid to the children as broth. She did not tell them what it was. Sigrid drank it and returned to her fingers. Eric drank it and looked at his mother's face for one long moment, and then looked away. He knew. He was 14. He knew. The temperature inside the wagon on day 10 during the stove's rest period dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. At 11 degrees, the water in the tin cups froze before Marta could complete the rotation. She added her own body heat, pressing 2 cups at a time against her skin, front and back, moving them in a continuous cycle. But her core temperature had dropped enough by day 10 that the process was taking 90 minutes per cup instead of 45. Her body was generating less heat than it had on day 1 because her body had less fuel than it had on day 1. The same feedback loop running in her now as it had been running in the wagon's entire thermal system. She noted this in her journal in the same tone she had used for everything else. Own heat production reduced, increase water rotation frequency to compensate. Then she put the journal away and picked up the cups. This is the point in survival accounts where people who are not going to make it typically stop making decisions. The mechanism is well documented in the research conducted decades later on Arctic explorers, high-altitude climbers, and shipwreck survivors. The body, starved of calories and warmth, begins to redirect its remaining resources from higher cognitive functions to core survival processes. Abstract planning, the ability to project forward in time, to model future scenarios, to make decisions whose consequences will not arrive for hours or days, degrades before physical function does. A person can still walk, still eat, still perform habitual tasks while the capacity for genuine strategic thinking has already dimmed. They feel normal. They feel tired, but normal. They do not feel themselves making worse decisions because the part of the brain that would notice the degradation is itself degraded. Marta knew about none of this research. What she knew was that on day 10 she read back through her journal entries from days 7 and 8 and found 2 calculation errors she could not account for. Small ones, the kind of arithmetic she had been doing correctly since she was 8 years old. She stared at them for a long time. Then she made herself do the calculations again, slowly, checking each step. She got different answers than the errors, but was not certain the new answers were correct either. She put the journal away and did not read it again for 2 days. Day 11 was the day Marta found out about Eric. She had asked him to go outside for the mid-morning snowpacking, the task he had performed twice daily since the storm's beginning, pressing snow against the wagon's base to maintain the insulating barrier that was, by this point, one of the primary things keeping the interior temperature from dropping to fully lethal levels. He had been outside for what she estimated as 15 minutes when she heard a sound that was not the wind, a different quality of impact, something specific and close and wrong near the wagon's left rear wheel. She forced the front flap open against the drifted snow and went out on the rope. 30 feet in the whiteout, moving hand over hand along the line, she found him at the wagon's rear corner. He was not standing. He was on his knees in the snow, his hands flat on the wagon's side panel, his head dropped forward in a posture of absolute exhaustion. Not resting, not pausing, but the posture of a body that has run its account to zero and is waiting for instructions it is no longer certain it can execute. She got him back inside. He was conscious. He was not injured. When she put food in front of him, the last of the salt pork, boiled with the remaining scraps of leather into a liquid thick enough to call soup, he tried to refuse it. He moved it toward Tobias's corner with a gesture so practiced and so automatic that it was clearly not the first time he had made it. It was the gesture of a habit, a long-established habit. Marta held the cup and looked at her son and understood. She went back through the food log in her journal, the precise accounting of what each person had eaten and when, recorded daily since day one. She read it with the new information as a key. The numbers for Eric, which she had recorded from what she had served him, did not match the caloric intake of a 14-year-old boy performing twice daily heavy labors in extreme cold. They matched the intake of a child half his size. She had recorded what she served him. She had not verified what he ate. He had been redirecting his portions to Tobias, to Sigrid, to Lars during the days Lars refused to eat, for at minimum 6 days, possibly longer. He had done it without announcement, without any bid for recognition, with the quiet, systematic thoroughness he brought to the rope checks and the snowpacking, as though it were simply one more task in the management of their survival and not an act of voluntary starvation. He was 14 years old, and he weighed at that moment perhaps 90 pounds. The date was January 18th, 1887. The temperature outside was 41 below zero. The wood supply had 30 hours left, possibly 36. Tobias's fever had not broken. Lars sat against the front wall with his eyes open and his hands in his lap, and his face arranged in an expression that had stopped corresponding to anything happening around him. Marta put the soup in Eric's hands and held them there until he drank it. Then she looked at the wood stack, and looked at the food supply, and looked at her husband, and looked at her children, and did the arithmetic one more time with the full and clear knowledge that her arithmetic might no longer be reliable. The numbers did not work, not at 30 hours of wood, not at 36. Outside, the wind continued at its sustained, indifferent velocity, pressing against the wagon's walls with the patience of something that did not experience time the way the people inside it did. It had been pressing for 11 days. It could press for 11 more. It did not have a food supply running low, or a fever climbing, or a boy on his knees in the snow. It simply continued. Lars said something in the darkness that night. One sentence in Norwegian. His voice had the rough, underused quality of a mechanism starting after long dormancy. Marta wrote it down in her journal. She wrote it in Norwegian, not English, and she never explained why she switched languages for that one entry on that one night. After weeks of writing in English, she wrote down what he said. Then she wrote nothing else. The stove ticked. Tobias breathed. The storm pressed against every surface of the wagon simultaneously, and somewhere in the buried dark, Marta Halvorsen held her son's empty cup and waited for an answer to a question she had not yet been able to form into words. On the morning of day 12, Lars dismantled the wagon's rear storage bench. It was a built-in structure, 3 boards forming a low platform along the wagon's rear wall, where the family had stored tools and the heavier supply barrels since leaving Minnesota. The boards were inch-thick oak, seasoned and dry, the kind of wood that burns long and hot and holds its heat after the flame has moved on. Lars worked without announcing what he was doing, using the cold chisel and the hammer, pulling each board free with the careful economy of a man who understood that the noise of rushed work costs more energy than the work itself. He stacked the boards beside the stove and looked at them with the expression of a man repricing something he had previously considered non-negotiable. 3 boards, perhaps 18 hours of fuel at current burn rate. It was not enough to close the gap. It was enough to change the arithmetic one more time, to push the terminal point forward into a range where something, some change in the storm, some external event, some option not yet visible, might become possible. Lars did not say this. He fed the first board into the stove in 2 pieces and sat back and watched the temperature on the thermometer begin, slowly, to climb. Marta noted it in her journal. Elle took the bench, perhaps 18 hours. Wind unchanged. She was running on something that was not energy anymore. It was closer to structural momentum. The body continuing to execute its established patterns because the patterns were grooved deep enough to run without conscious fuel. She had not slept more than 2 consecutive hours since day 9. Her hands' tremor had extended to her forearms by day 11. When she stood too quickly, the edges of her vision darkened for a moment before clearing, a sign she recognized from the months after Astrid died in Minnesota, when she had forgotten to eat for days at a stretch and her body had delivered the same warning in the same form. She stood carefully now. She rose in stages. Tobias's fever had broken on the morning of day 11, dropped suddenly in the night, leaving him soaked and limp and exhausted but cool to the touch, his breathing slower and more even than it had been in 3 days. This was the first thing that had moved in the right direction since the storm began, and Marta had recorded it in the journal with the same flat precision she used for everything else, and had sat for a moment with her hand on Tobias's chest, feeling the steady movement of his breathing, and had allowed herself exactly that moment before moving to the next problem. Eric had eaten. For 2 days following his collapse at the wagon's rear corner, Marta had administered his food directly, placing each portion in his hands, staying present until it was consumed, watching with a surveillance that left no room for redirection. His color had improved by day 12. He was not strong, but he was no longer the color of old candle wax, and the fine tremor in his hands, which Marta had not noticed until she was watching for it, had reduced to something intermittent rather than constant. He had not tried to give his food away again. He seemed to understand that the option had been revoked. Day 12 passed in the manner of the days before it. The stove cycles, the water rotation, Sigrid's fingers, the wind, but with a quality that was different in a way that was difficult to name precisely. The interior of the wagon had taken on the specific atmosphere of a place where the available actions have been fully exhausted, and what remains is the waiting itself, stripped of any task to attach itself to. The bench boards burned, the thermometer held. Tobias slept. Lars sat. On the afternoon of day 12, Lars did something that had not happened since day 5. He opened his journal, a small, plain notebook he had used since Minnesota for farm calculations and land measurements, never for personal entries, and wrote something in it. Marta did not read it. She saw him writing, saw him close the notebook, saw him put it in the inner pocket of his coat, where he kept documents he considered important. He did not write anything else, but the act of writing, the decision to record something, to create a mark that assumed a future in which someone might read it, was itself a change in his position relative to the situation. A man who has stopped expecting a future does not write things down. She filed this information without commenting on it and went back to the water cups. The morning of day 13 brought a change in the wind so pronounced that even Sigrid noticed it. The sustained roar that had been the sonic wallpaper of their existence for 12 days shifted, not ceased, not calmed, but changed pitch, rising briefly to a higher register and then dropping, and in the drop there was a gap, a brief interval of relative quiet that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and then closed again. 4 seconds of reduced wind after 12 days of constant was not silence. But it was different, and different was the most significant word in the Halvorsen family's vocabulary at that moment. Lars had his head up before the second gap came. His eyes were clear. The gaps increased in frequency through the morning, irregular, unpredictable, ranging from 2 seconds to nearly 20, but accumulating into a pattern that Marta recognized as structural change rather than fluctuation. The storm was not ending, but something in its architecture was shifting. The way a building shifts before it settles, the deep reorganization that precedes a new equilibrium. She had been watching the wind for 12 days with the focused attention of someone who had nothing else to watch, and she could read it now the way Lars read wood grain. Not perfectly, not with certainty, but with calibrated intuition. She thought the worst might be passing. She did not write this in the journal. The wood supply with the bench boards had perhaps 6 hours left. It was in this specific window. The storm weakening but not broken, the fuel nearly gone, the family depleted to the boundary of their functional capacity, that the sound came from outside the wagon's left rear wall. Not the wind, not the wagon's structural creaking. A different sound, deliberate in its rhythm, the specific quality of impact that comes from something with intention behind it. 3 strikes against the exterior wall. A pause, 3 more. Nobody in the wagon moved for a full 3 seconds. Lars was at the front flap before Marta had fully registered what she was hearing. He stopped with his hand on the tie rope, and she watched his back as he stood there, and she understood what he was calculating. The sound could be a person. It could also be a branch, torn loose by the wind and lodged against the wagon, striking intermittently. It could be Bram, somehow having broken his line. It could be any number of things that were not a person. But the rhythm had been too deliberate for debris and too precise for an animal, and Lars undid the tie rope and opened the flap. The cold that entered in the opening was a physical force, not a sensation, but a pressure, dropping the interior temperature several degrees in the seconds the flap was open. Lars put his face to the gap and looked out into the white, and then pulled back, and looked at Marta with an expression she had not seen on his face in 12 days. He went out on the rope. She held the flap's edge and counted his movements by the rope's tension, feeling each step he took as a slight shift in the line, tracking him the 30 feet to the wagon's left rear corner. The rope went still, a long stillness, perhaps a minute, perhaps 2, in which the wind continued and the stove ticked, and Sigrid had stopped moving her fingers and was watching the flap with wide, fully present eyes, the game suspended for the first time in days. The rope moved again. Lars was coming back. He was not alone. The man who came through the flap behind Lars was not from the settlement 12 miles away, not a neighbor, not a member of any wagon train. He was a Lakota man, perhaps 40 years old, dressed in a way that was visibly different from any clothing in the wagon. Layered hides, specifically cut and fitted, with a construction that covered the face and hands in a manner that the settlers' wool and cotton did not approach in efficiency. He was not large. He moved in the confined space of the wagon with an economy that suggested he was accustomed to small spaces and to situations requiring care. He carried a hide bag over one shoulder and a bundle of something wrapped in canvas under his arm. He looked at Tobias first. Marta would write about this detail 20 years later, in 1907, in a long retrospective entry in a different journal. That he looked at the baby first, before anything else, before Lars, before the stove, before making any assessment of the space or the situation. She wrote that this told her something she did not know how to articulate at the time, but had spent years since trying to find words for. He set the canvas bundle down and opened it. Inside was wood, not the random scraps of furniture the Halvorsens had been feeding the stove, but prepared fuel, cut to a consistent size and clearly selected for density and dryness. He fed 3 pieces into the stove with the practiced efficiency of someone who had built fires in difficult conditions many times. Then he opened the hide bag. Pemmican is a food that European settlers in the 1880s had heard about but rarely understood in its actual significance. It is not trail food, it is not a convenience. It is the result of a precise and sophisticated preservation technology developed over centuries by the plains peoples. Dried lean meat, pounded fine, combined with rendered fat at a specific ratio, sometimes mixed with dried berries, packed into hide pouches in a form that resists spoilage for months or years. Its caloric density is extraordinary. A single pound contains more energy than 3 pounds of most other dried foods. A small piece of it, at the size of a man's fist, contains enough calories to sustain a working adult for a full day in cold conditions. He had 4 pounds of it in the bag. He broke pieces off and distributed them with a directness that bypassed any ceremony. To Eric first, then Sigrid, a smaller piece to Lars, a portion set aside near Tobias's blankets, for when Marta judged the baby ready to eat. He was not asking permission and not seeking acknowledgement. He was executing a task with the same focused efficiency that Marta had been applying to the water cups for 13 days, and she recognized the quality of it immediately from the inside, the way you recognize the approach of someone moving at your own speed. Then he did something that would take Marta years to fully understand. He went to the wagon's rear left corner, the corner that had been the coldest spot in the interior since day 3, where the wood had contracted most severely and the gap packing had failed twice. And he examined the wall with his hands, running his fingers along the seams the way Eric ran his fingers along the bell ropes each morning. He worked from the outside, going back into the cold for 20 minutes, while Lars held the flap, packing the gaps with a material from his bag that was neither wool nor sod, but something Marta could not identify by sight, a dense, fibrous substance that compressed into the gaps with a precision the wool had never achieved. When he came back inside, the corner was sealed, completely sealed. The temperature inside the wagon over the following 2 hours climbed to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm, but 28 was 10 degrees above where they had been, and 10 degrees was the difference between water that froze in the cups and water that stayed liquid, the difference between a baby with a recovering fever sleeping in tolerable cold and that same baby sleeping in a cold that required his body to fight 2 things at once. He stayed for 6 hours. He said nothing that Marta recorded, and he did not stay long enough for Lars to fully understand who had come and what had been done, because by the time Lars had eaten enough pemmican to bring him fully back into himself, the man with the grey horse, tethered outside the wagon's right side, which was why they had not heard it arrive. The wind, taking the sound away, had checked the fire one last time and gone back through the flap and into the white. Lars went to the flap and looked out. The rope showed the man moving toward his horse with the same economic efficiency with which he had done everything else. Lars called after him. Marta wrote this only as L called out without recording the words. And the only response was the wind, which had dropped another degree in its intensity while they sat inside and ate. The storm was ending, slowly, unevenly, in the way that very large systems end, not with a clear terminus, but with a gradual reduction of force, a bleeding away of energy across hours and then days. But the fire was burning. The children had eaten. And in the corner of the wagon, where the cold had been the most persistent and the most invasive, there was a seal that held against everything the night sent at it. Marta sat with Tobias in her lap and looked at the flap through which the man had left, and felt something that she would spend the next 40 years trying to find the right word for. She never fully found it. The storm broke on January 21st. Not all at once. Nothing about that winter operated all at once. It broke the way ice breaks on a river in spring, in sections, with false stops and reversals, the wind dropping to nothing for an hour, and then returning at half its previous strength, then a quarter, then a long silence that lasted through the night and became, by morning, the real thing, the real silence, the kind that meant it was over. Lars was the first one out. He forced the rear flap open against the snow that had compacted around its edges, pushed through into light so bright and so total that he had to stop with his eyes closed for a full minute before he could tolerate it. 14 days of interior dark had left his eyes unprepared for a world in which every surface was white and the sun, low on the southern horizon, reflected off all of it simultaneously. He stood, with his eyes closed and his face turned upward, and the cold on his skin, still severe, still below zero, but static now, not moving, not pressing, and breathed. What he saw when he finally opened his eyes was a landscape that no longer resembled the one they had arrived at in October. The snow had reorganized the terrain entirely. The slight rise to the northwest, which had been a feature, a named thing, a landmark, was gone, subsumed into a general elevation that the drifting had produced across the entire visible surface. The frozen creek to the east had disappeared under a smooth white cover that made it indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. The sod windbreak Lars had built with such care was a low mound, barely visible, already being reclaimed by the geometry of the drifts. The wagon itself sat inside a depression in the snow, surrounded by drifts that rose above the canvas top on 3 sides. A white room within a white room. Bram was alive. The horse stood in a hollow that his own body heat had melted into the snowpack over 14 days, a cavity shaped exactly like a horse's life, the outline of survival pressed into the frozen ground. He was thin, visibly, dramatically thin, his ribs countable from 10 feet away. But standing, his eyes responsive, his nostrils working at the cold air with a steadiness that meant the core was intact. Lars went to him and put his forehead against the horse's neck, and stood there for a moment that he never described, and that Marta did not record because she did not see it. She was inside, getting the children ready to move. The decision to leave the wagon and walk the 12 miles to the settlement was made without extended deliberation. The wagon's fuel was ash. The food supply was 4 small pieces of pemmican that Marta had rationed with the same precision she had applied to everything else, setting aside a departure reserve the night before with the focused calculation of someone who had already decided they were leaving in the morning. She had repacked the essential items in the night, the journals, the photograph of her parents, the painted wooden horse that had been Astrid's, the documents, land claim papers, the family's identification records, folded flat inside Lars's coat. Everything else stayed. The brass thermometer stayed, the cast-iron stove stayed, the broken barrel and the empty molasses jar, and the harness that had contributed its leather to their survival stayed in the wagon. Marta looked at the interior one last time before she climbed out, at the packed walls and the stained floor, and the corner where she had held Tobias through 12 nights. And then she turned and went through the flap, and did not look back. The journey to the settlement took 7 hours. Lars had rigged a sledge from the 2 remaining intact wagon boards, lashing them together with harness rope and creating a low platform that Bram could pull with the traces shortened. Tobias rode on the sledge, wrapped in every remaining blanket, still weak from the fever, but alert in a way that had returned in the 18 hours since the pemmican. Sigrid walked beside the sledge for the first 2 miles, and then climbed onto it without asking, and nobody said anything about it. Eric walked with Lars at the front beside Bram, and the 2 of them navigated by the sun's position, and by the slight topographic variations in the snowpack that Lars had learned to read in the months since arriving on this land. The cold was 22 below zero. Without wind, this was manageable. What manageable meant, in practice, was this. The family stopped every 40 minutes, clustered together around Bram's body heat for 10 minutes, checked Tobias, checked each other's faces for the white patches of frostbite that appear without sensation, ate a small piece of pemmican, and moved again. It was a system Marta organized on the first stop without being asked, tapping each face in sequence with 2 fingers, forehead, cheeks, nose, checking the color and texture of the skin with the same methodical attention she had given to the thermometer inside the wagon. She found early frostbite on Lars's left cheek on the 3rd stop, a patch of waxy pale skin the size of a silver dollar, and pressed her warm palm against it for the 10-minute rest, and checked it again before they moved and said nothing to him about it, because he already knew. The settlement appeared not as buildings, but as smoke. A thin grey vertical line against the white sky, perhaps 2 miles out, rising straight up in the still air. The signature of a chimney, drawing well, of a fire with sufficient fuel, of an enclosed warm space maintained by people who had not run out of anything critical. Lars saw it first and pointed without speaking. Sigrid, riding the sledge, sat up straighter. Eric walked faster without being aware he was doing it. They arrived at 3:15 in the afternoon. The settlement was 11 families, a general store, a small Lutheran church that had been converted into a warming station during the worst of the storm, and a population that had spent 14 days in various states of crisis of their own. 2 men from the settlement had died, one attempting to reach an outlying claim on day 4, found frozen the following spring, and one elderly man whose constitution had not survived the sustained cold. The settlers who gathered around the Halverson family when they came in from the White were people who understood from the inside what the Halversons had just come through, and this shared understanding produced a quality of reception that required no ceremony and no explanation. They were fed. They were warmed. Eric slept for 16 hours. The world the Halversons returned to was not the world they had left in January. The scale of the catastrophe that the winter of 1886 to 87 had produced across the northern plains was still being calculated when the Halversons reached the settlement, but the edges of it were already visible in the reports coming in from every direction. The cattle were gone, not reduced, gone. The great open-range herds that had made fortunes for ranchers across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota had been destroyed with a completeness that observers struggled to put into numbers. Estimates varied. 60% losses, 70, 90, because the counting itself was difficult when the animals were buried under snowdrifts that would not melt until April. The open-range cattle industry, as it had existed since the end of the Civil War, ended that winter. It did not contract or adapt. It ended the way something ends when the losses exceed the capacity for recovery. The ranchers who had grazed millions of animals on unfenced federal land, moving them freely across hundreds of miles with the seasons, watching the profits accumulate through the mild years of the early 1880s, found themselves in the spring of 1887 looking at bones and hides where their herds had been. The famous cattle barons of the northern plains, men whose names had appeared in eastern newspapers as emblems of Western prosperity, lost fortunes so completely that several never recovered financially. One prominent Montana rancher, who had carried more than 10,000 cattle into that winter, emerged in the spring with fewer than 100. What replaced open-range ranching was something more careful and more permanent: fenced pastures, stored feed, winter shelter for animals, managed breeding, the systematic application of the lessons that the hard winter had written in the most expensive possible ink. The ranching industry that exists on the northern plains today, structured, sheltered, managed for resilience, was shaped in its essential architecture by one winter's catastrophic proof of what happens when you assume the land will accommodate whatever you ask of it. The settlers adapted too in ways that were specific and lasting. The sod house, the low, earth-bermed structure that looked primitive and was not, became the dominant building form on the Dakota homestead, not because settlers couldn't build wood-frame houses, but because the sod houses, thermal mass and below-grade construction, provided a resilience against extreme cold that no wood-frame structure could match at equivalent cost. Settlers who had survived the winter in wagons or poorly insulated cabins built their next structure differently, with a systematic attention to heat retention and fuel storage that had been earned rather than designed. Lars filed his homestead claim in February of 1887, 6 weeks after emerging from the wagon. He returned to the land in April when the snow had retreated enough to make travel possible, and he looked at the frozen creek and the low rise and the buried remnants of his sod windbreak, and he made his calculations. The wagon was there, still standing in its depression, the canvas intact, the interior exactly as they had left it. He noted the condition of the axle repair, still holding remarkably, and the state of the remaining wheel. He noted the corner where the Lakota man had packed the seam, and he ran his fingers along it the way Eric ran his fingers along the bow ropes, testing, measuring, trying to understand through touch what the material was and how it had been applied. He could not identify it. He never could. The homestead was built and worked for 30 years. Lars farmed it with the specific caution of a man who had learned the hard way what this land required. Not optimism, not the pamphlet's promises, but a precise and ongoing negotiation with conditions that did not forgive assumptions. He built a sod house first, then a wood frame addition, then a proper barn with winter shelter for animals. He kept a detailed record of temperatures and snowfall and the behavior of the sky in ways that the Signal Corps station in Bismarck would have recognized as methodologically sound. He never spoke about the 14 days in the wagon, not to his neighbors, not to his children when they were old enough to ask, not to the journalist from a Bismarck newspaper who came through the county in 1899 collecting survivor accounts from the hard winter. The journalist left without Lars's story. Eric recovered his full strength by early summer, though Marta noted in a retrospective journal entry written in 1891 that he had emerged from that winter with a quality of self-containment that was different in kind from what he had carried before. Not damaged, she wrote carefully, but altered, the way metal is altered by the process that hardens it. He married in 1895, farmed his own claim adjacent to his parents', and was described by everyone who knew him in later life as a man of extraordinary reliability, the kind of person a community reaches for instinctively when something goes wrong. Sigrid never stopped counting. The finger game evolved over the years into an interest in mathematics that took her, eventually, to a teacher's college in Yankton in 1897. An outcome so improbable from the vantage point of the buried wagon on day 6 that Marta wrote about it in her journal with a quality of wonder she rarely permitted herself. Tobias, the baby who had run a fever at 41 below, whose silence on day 11 had been the most frightening sound in the wagon, grew up with no memory of any of it. He worked as an engineer in Minneapolis, married twice, had 4 children, and died in 1962 at the age of 76, having never, so far as any record shows, been told the details of what his mother held at bay during those 14 days to keep him alive. The land where the wagon sat through the storm is now part of a county road, right of way in Sully County, South Dakota. The road is paved. It runs straight across the flat terrain in the way that roads run on the plains, without compromise, without adaptation to features that no longer exist or never existed in the first place. In January, when the temperature drops below 0 and the wind comes down from the north without anything to stop it, the road drifts over within hours of being ploughed. The county maintenance crew clears it and it drifts again, and they clear it again, and this cycle continues through the winter with a patient, practiced regularity that people who live there recognize as simply the nature of the thing. The man with the grey horse was never identified. Marta searched for him, not physically after the first year, but in the available records, the agency documents, the accounts of Lakota movements through that region during that winter. She found references in the agency records to a family group that had been in the general area of what is now Sully County during January of 1887, moving between winter camps in the way that the Lakota managed the cold, with a mobility that the settlers, fixed to their claims, could not employ. She could not narrow it further. The records were not designed to preserve the identities of individuals moving through a landscape that the federal government was, at that precise historical moment, in the process of systematically removing them from. This is the sentence that Marta returned to again and again in the later journal entries, and the fact that the man who saved her family was moving through land that was being taken from his people, while she and Lars were there to claim a piece of it. She never resolved this. The journals show her returning to it in 1924, in 1928, and finally, in the last entry she ever wrote, in the spring of 1931, a few months before her death. She wrote it plainly in the direct language she had used for everything, the fact of what he did, the fact of what was being done to his people, the fact that she did not know his name, and the fact that she had thought about him in varying degrees of intensity for every one of the 44 years since he walked back out through the wagon flap into the white. She wrote one more line after that. Then she closed the journal and placed it in the same trunk that held the photograph of her parents from Bergen and the painted wooden horse that had been Astrid's, and the trunk was closed and stored and not opened again until 1962, when Tobias, the baby, the engineer, the man who had never been told, found it in a Minneapolis storage facility following the settlement of his mother's estate 31 years after her death. What he did with what he read and what it meant to him to learn for the first time what his first winter had cost is not recorded anywhere. But the journal survived, and the question Marta had carried for 44 years, the one she never answered, the one she returned to at the end, was still there on the last page, waiting. The last entry in Marta Halvorsson's final journal is 11 words long. Written in Norwegian, the language she had been born into, the language she had largely abandoned for English over 40 years of American life, the language she returned to at the end the way people return to the things that formed them before they knew they were being formed. It reads, in translation, I have been warm for 44 years. I have not forgotten what cold felt like. I'm not sure I want to. 11 words after a lifetime of precise, exhaustive record-keeping, the temperature logs, the food inventories, the detailed accounting of everything that mattered and much that didn't. 11 words at the end. The compression itself is the statement. Consider what those words contain. 44 years of warmth, named and counted, not taken for granted, counted the way you count something you know the price of because you paid it yourself. The cold remembered not as trauma to be processed or wound to be healed, but as information kept deliberately, maintained with intention. And then the last clause, I'm not sure I want to, which is not resignation and not nostalgia and not any of the things it might seem to be on first reading. It is something more precise. It is the statement of a woman who understood that the cold had given her something along with everything it took, and who was not yet ready, at the end of her life, to decide whether the transaction had been fair. Marta Halvorsson died in the spring of 1931 in Minneapolis, in a warm room. She was 79 years old. She had outlived Lars by 6 years. He had died in 1925, quietly, on the homestead he had farmed for 3 decades. In the sod house he built the first spring after the hard winter, with a methodical attention to thermal mass and heat retention that the neighbors noticed and eventually copied. He died without having spoken publicly about the 14 days in the wagon, and the silence he maintained around it was so complete and so consistent that his grandchildren, Eric's children, Sigrid's children, grew up knowing only that their grandfather had come through something hard in the winter of 1887, and that it was not a subject he welcomed. What Lars kept in his coat's inner pocket for the rest of his life was the small, plain notebook in which he had written something on the afternoon of day 12. The day he dismantled the bench, the day something came back into his eyes. The notebook went with him to the grave. Nobody read it. Nobody knows what he wrote. This absence, the thing Lars recorded and protected and never shared, is its own kind of document. It tells a different story than Marta's 11 words, but it tells a story nonetheless. Some experiences produce language. Others produce its opposite, a guarded silence that is itself a form of testimony, the shape of something too large or too specific to be reduced to words without losing what made it true. Both responses are present in the aftermath of the hard winter of 1886 to 87. The historical record of that winter is dense with accounts, settler diaries, newspaper reports, signal corps logs, the retrospective testimonies collected by county historians across the Dakotas and Montana in the early 20th century. The accounts share certain features: the specific quality of the cold, the inadequacy of preparation, the ways in which the land refused all assumptions. But they also diverge in a specific and revealing way. Some survivors talked about it for the rest of their lives, compulsively, in detail, as though the repetition were a form of management. Others, like Lars, closed around it and said nothing. The silence and the talking were both attempts at the same thing, to find a position relative to an experience that did not fit inside ordinary life. The hard winter reshaped the American West in ways that are still structurally present today. The end of open-range ranching was not just an economic event, it was the end of a specific idea. The idea that the land of the northern plains was infinitely accommodating, that the scale of its apparent abundance could absorb any level of exploitation without consequence. That idea had been the engine of the boom years of the early 1880s, and the winter of 1886 to 87 disproved it so completely and so expensively that the disproof became permanent. The fenced pastures, the stored hay, the weather monitoring systems, the emergency protocols that govern how ranchers and farmers on the northern plains manage winter risk today. All of it runs in a direct line back to the specific lessons the hard winter wrote in Cattle Bones and Frozen Ground. The Signal Corps weather observation network that failed to deliver warnings to the Halverson family in January of 1887 was expanded and reformed in the years following the hard winter, partly in direct response to the documented failure of the warning system during that winter. The Weather Bureau, which replaced the Signal Corps in 1891, built a denser network of observation stations and invested in faster communication infrastructure. The forecast verification standards it developed in the 1890s were shaped by the specific ways that the 1886 to 87 forecasts had failed. The National Weather Service, which exists today and sends alerts directly to the phone in your pocket, is a descendant of that reform. The pemmican recipe that sustained the Halverson family on days 13 and 14 was not a recent innovation when the man with the grey horse carried it in his bag. It was ancient. The specific combination of rendered fat, dried meat, and caloric density that made pemmican capable of sustaining life in extreme cold had been developed and refined by the plains peoples over centuries of living in exactly the conditions that killed cattle and destroyed wagons and pushed European settlers to the edge of their capacity. The knowledge existed. It had always existed on the land the settlers were claiming, carried by the people who had developed it in direct response to the same winters that were now arriving to instruct the newcomers. This is the detail that stays. Not the courage of the Halverson family, which was real. Not the competence of Lars's wood management or Marta's water rotation or Eric's silent redistribution of food, all of which were genuine acts of survival intelligence. These things are true, and they matter. But underneath all of them, running through the entire 14 days like the frozen creek that Lars had used as a landmark, present, invisible, essential, was the knowledge that the land already held. Knowledge that the settlers did not seek and were not taught. Knowledge that arrived in a hide bag on a grey horse at the specific moment when every other resource had been exhausted. The question Marta returned to in 1924, in 1928, in 1931, was not really about gratitude, though gratitude was part of it. It was about the structure of the situation, who held knowledge and who held land, and how those two things had been distributed, and what it meant that the distribution was so precisely inverted. She was not a political thinker in the formal sense. She was a woman who kept exact records. And the exact record of what had happened did not allow for a version of the story in which this detail was minor or incidental. It was the center. She knew it was the center. The wagon she had lived in for 14 days still stood on the claim in April of 1887 when Lars returned to begin building. He used the remaining intact boards from its walls in the construction of the first outbuilding, a small storage structure set into the hillside on the property's north edge. Some of those boards may have been in the ground for decades before the building finally failed. The canvas, which had held through 14 days of assault, was repurposed as a covering for the haystack that first summer. By 1890, there was no visible remnant of the wagon at all, absorbed into the ongoing material life of a working farm. But the small painted wooden horse that had been Astrid's, the one Marta carried out of the wagon in her pack on the morning of January 22nd, wrapped in the same cloth as the photograph of her parents, survived all of it. It was in the trunk that Tobias found in 1962, alongside the journals and the photograph and the land claim documents, and the single entry written in Norwegian at the end of the last journal. A child's toy painted red and white, perhaps 4 inches tall, with one ear slightly chipped from a journey or a fall, or simply the passage of years. It had crossed an ocean, it had crossed 2 states, it had survived 14 days in a buried wagon at 40 below zero, carried in a box that also held Marta's first descriptions of the Bergen harbour and her list of what would likely go wrong, and her precise daily accounting of food and temperature and the things that mattered. Tobias held it in his hand in a Minneapolis storage facility in 1962, a man of 76 who had never been told the story of his first winter, reading his mother's words for the first time across a distance of 31 years. Outside, it was April. The temperature was 47 degrees Fahrenheit above zero. The sun was out. He read the last 11 words. He sat with them for a long time in the quiet of the storage room, the wooden horse in his hand, the journal open on his knee. This man who had been the baby, the silent one, the one whose chest Marta had watched in the dark for 14 days to make sure it was still rising. He had no memory of any of it. He had been too young to carry the experience consciously, which meant he had been spared the specific weight that Eric carried, and that Lars sealed inside a notebook, and that Marta turned over for 44 years like a stone she kept finding in her pocket. What he carried instead, without knowing he carried it, without knowing where it came from, was his life. The fact of it. The 76 years of warmth and work and ordinary human continuity that had been made possible by a woman who held a tin cup against her chest in a buried wagon and counted every breath. The cold that made that necessary is still there. January on the northern plains has not changed its essential character. The wind still comes down from Canada without anything to stop it, and the temperature still drops to places where exposed skin freezes in minutes, and the flat white land still offers the same total, featureless exposure that it offered to every person who has ever tried to live on it. What has changed is the system around the cold, the warnings that arrive before it, the structures that resist it, the knowledge that has been accumulated generation by generation about what it requires and what it takes, and what it is willing to give back. Most of that knowledge was bought at a price that can be calculated precisely in the way Marta calculated everything, in degrees and days and the weight of supplies and the count of the people who came through and the count of the people who did not. 500 settlers in the Dakota Territory alone, one winter. Names in county records and church registers and the sparse, factual language of the Signal Corps logs. Marta Halverson's name is not in the casualty records. Neither are Eric's, Sigrid's, Lars's, Tobias's. They are in the survival records, which are a different kind of document, not a list of endings, but an unbroken thread of continuity, the fact of one family's persistence, written into every year that followed, into the children of their children, and the land they farmed, and the journals Marta kept, with her unflinching precision, until she had nothing left to say, except 11 words in her first language at the end. The wooden horse is in a private collection in Minneapolis. The journals are in the archives of the State Historical Society of North Dakota in Bismarck, donated in 1978 by Eric's granddaughter, who had kept them for 16 years after Tobias's death before deciding they belonged somewhere they could be read. They can be read, they are read, by researchers, by historians, by people who find their way to the archive for reasons they can't always explain, and sit with the small, precise handwriting and the temperature logs and the food inventories and the entry written in Norwegian at the end. The archive is warm, the reading room has good light. The journals smell of age and of something underneath the age, something that might be the specific odor of pine resin from the stove, preserved in the paper over 140 years, or might be nothing at all, just the ordinary smell of old paper in a dry room. But it is there, or it seems to be there, and the people who sit with those journals often report that they feel it, that particular quality of cold pressing through the words, the sense of a space that was 14 days long and 10 feet wide and held 5 people and everything they had, suspended in the middle of a landscape that did not care whether they survived it. They did. That is the whole of it, and it is enough.